The cell is complex beyond our imaginations, and truly at this point, we still don't understand most of what is going on inside the cell. Okay, so one of the most amazing aspects or functions within the cell is movement. Whether you're talking about moving things around inside the cell, because it has to shuttle things around all over the place, or moving the cell itself, cell movement is definitely a remarkable feat, especially when we realize how little about it we really know. The more we learn about the cell, the more ignorant we become, essentially, because we know so little. But it also illustrates an intelligent design concept called irreducible complexity. You may be familiar with this term. Michael Behe introduced this term in his book, Darwin's Black Box. And to him, it's a test of whether or not something was intelligently designed. Is what he looks for, what he calls irreducible complexity. Basically, he looks at a machine inside the cell, or some organ or tissue, some organism, and looks to see if the components of that system themselves are functional, or if the system itself is only functional if all the components are in place. So can this system be reduced and still remain functional? That's irreducible complexity. He uses the mousetrap as his initial illustration of what he means by this. He would show the mousetrap and say, all of the components of the mousetrap only work if all of the components are there together. None of the components of the mousetrap function except to be part of a mousetrap. And the mousetrap doesn't function unless all the components are there. So this is his test for intelligent design, and you can apply this to just about anything that's going on within the cell, truly. But cell movement illustrates this quite well. Now, the cell moves in all kinds of different ways, and I'll show you a few of those. This is a colonial algae. So each one of these is a...
Welcome back to Truth Seekers. I used to believe in evolution from the single cell on up to us until I was about 30 years old. And then I started to become exposed to a whole different way of looking at things, and all of the science fell apart as far as I'm concerned. I think it's just pure conjecture, wild conjecture with very little evidence behind it to believe that we came from single cells on up to us, or that life could have come from chemicals up to the complexity of a single cell. But you guys can call up. The phone numbers are going to be popping right back up there right now. And if you have any comments relating to this or anything we've talked about in the past relating to spiritual, philosophical, truth-seeking, give us a call if you'd like. In the meantime, I'm going to ask Brandon what he thought of that. You haven't seen this film before.
I have not seen that one. I missed it, but it's a good film, it looks like. A lot of good graphics. And yeah, something you said really stood out. I thought that the way that it's presented, or something that he said, the way this was presented, Haeckel presented it, and it's still presented in schools these days. You go to grade school and such, and they talk about the simple little cell, how simple the cell is, and it really conveys this idea that, you know, you can go from protoplasm or something onto living matter, and it's so incredibly ludicrous based on what we know now. There's so much complexity there. Like he said, it's like a incredibly complex city. I like to use the example of archaeology when I talk about this. When we find carvings, or we find something that mankind has created thousands of years ago, we don't question whether or not this was formed by nature, random processes, erosion, carving these symbols onto stone, things like that. Nature doesn't make things that look like they were man-made, that are very complex, like writing and pottery, things like that. Otherwise, archaeology would be very confusing. But we know that nature doesn't do that. So we look at things like the cell, and there's incredible complexity there. There should be no doubt in anyone's mind that it was designed.
Yeah, William will be right with you in talking about archaeology and the languages there. I mean, those are just simple letters, and you're not going to get that by chance, a whole statement carved out of stone in one language. I mean,
right.
Could have been a combination of Russian, French, English hieroglyphics, I mean, by chance, but the symbols have to make sense within the language. And these things are so much more complex. The DNA language is way more complex.
I was just going to say, there are languages in the cell, DNA, amino acids, a lot of real language.
It goes against common sense, but yet we're sheep-like people. We herd-like people. We tend to follow our leaders and teachers. William, how are you doing tonight?
I'm fairly well, and yourself?
Good, thank you.
Good.
What would you like
Thanks.
to share with us?
Well, you know, I'm a student chemist at Portland State University, and I, for a long time, well, actually, I was a biology major for 2 years, and, you know, I just caught your show. I've watched it several times before, talking about evolution and whatnot, and I suppose from my, if I may make a conjecture of your program being maybe, is it intelligent design? Am I right?
Well, we talk about anything relating to spiritual and philosophical truth-seeking. We talk a lot about fulfilled prophecy, archaeology, but we talk an awful lot about science too. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, I was listening to your show, and I heard that, you know, it was designed, and I don't have a problem with the theory of intelligent design. I myself am a lifelong Catholic by choice, but it's kind of my kind of opinion about the whole evolutionary debate versus creationism or design or the whole process is that I mean, I've read on the origin of species, and it's a very apologetically written piece of literature, and I just think the debate has gotten so marginalized for two groups of people. I mean, you have the staunch atheists like Richard Dawkins and the other physicist, the God particle guy, I can't remember his name, and then you have, you know, staunch Christians who you know, have marginalized science, and I think it has gotten very hostile. And it's something that's gotten incredibly convoluted on both sides.